Professor Glenn Diesen, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
A lot I want to pick your brain about. Let's start off with the obvious: Russia, Ukraine. Donald Trump, when he took office, said that he was going to end this war in a matter of days. Obviously, he has not been able to do that. He's tried to have several conversations with Putin. Obviously, he's met with Zelensky. He's brought Zelensky to the White House. They've had seemingly tense relationship and then friendly relationship. I mean, it's just kind of, I don't know where we're at with this war. Do you see an end to this war anytime soon? And if not, why?
Well, miracles could happen. These peace negotiations could go somewhere, but I think it is highly unlikely. I think rather that this will be resolved on the battlefield, simply because the Russian demands now are quite high, and they're difficult for the Ukrainians to meet them, and any pressure from the United States is being countered by Europeans, which are trying to convince Zelensky not to take any deal. So for this reason, I don't think it's going to be any acceptance here. And we even heard now when Zelensky spoke about what's required in a peace agreement, he suggested Russia still have to be punished, they have to be held accountable. The Europeans still want the powerful security guarantees. They want essentially Ukraine to fall within NATO's orbit. And this is problematic because this is why the Russians invaded. They want the security guarantee of NATO not being in Ukraine, while Ukraine demands the security guarantee of NATO being in Ukraine. So this is largely mutually exclusive. So, but again, this is a war of attrition. It's being lost at the moment. So as Ukraine continues to lose, I think at some point any peace negotiation will take the form of a surrender.
And do you think Ukraine is losing?
Oh, I think, that's very clear. I think it's often confused because people look at the maps, they see, they're not changing significantly. That means nothing is happening. But this is a very high intensity war with mass casualties. It's a war of attrition. That is, they're seeking to exhaust the enemy. And in a war of attrition, you essentially bleed out the enemy. And when the adversary's army has become depleted, then you go for the territory, because it would make much sense for the Russians to storm heavily defended fortification lines, which NATO has helped to build since 2014. And so this is the main thought. So you measure usually a war of attrition by looking at the amount of casualties which have been taken, how much weapons they have. And at the moment, the Ukrainians are suffering from massive shortage of manpower. They're having massive shortage of weaponry. And now, of course, the US is also pulling back. And overall, the support for it across the Western public is dropping. Support within the Ukrainian population is dropping. You're seeing growing desertion day by day. Cities are falling much faster now, simply because there's enough holes in the defensive lines for the Russians to begin to encircle big formation of Ukrainian troops. So it's nearing the end game.
Yeah, I've been surprised by this war. I have to be honest that when it started, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, I thought it would be over in a matter of weeks. I mean, I really thought that Russia would just march in, take pretty much everything up to the river, and that would be the end of it. But this has gone on for a really long time. Do you think that is because, I think kind of similar to the United States, when the United States goes to war, like in Afghanistan against the Taliban, right? I mean, people thought, the United States, the biggest army in the world, could take the Taliban. And then 20 years later, absolutely could not. Taliban ends up winning that war, and the U.S. had to leave Afghanistan. So kind of the idea that these strong militaries, do you think that it's that Russia's just not as strong as we thought it was as a military, the same way people would look at the U.S. and think, the U.S. can do anything. But in reality, in practice, wars are really tough. Wars are hard to win. So why do you think it's taking, what is Russia's goal? If it's going to be won on the battlefield, what does that look like?
Well, I think a lot can be said also about the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainians have fought much harder than anyone had predicted. So they've been willing to sustain mass casualties. They've been fighting well. They've been holding in. I think you can argue that the Russians underestimated the the extent to which a unique national identity had emerged in Ukraine as well. So a lot of things can be said, which was a miscalculation, but also has to be said that that the war changed its character dramatically over the years, because when the Russians went in 2022, they went in with a bit less than 100,000 men. You can't take over a country like Ukraine with 100,000. But what we also learned is on the first day of the invasion, Zelensky came out and he said, well, the Russians have now contacted us. They said they're willing to start negotiations, but they want us to restore our neutrality, that is no NATO. We're willing to discuss this with them. And then on day 3, he confirmed, yes, we're going to start negotiations now. We can speak about restoring Ukraine's neutrality. So this was the Russian objective. They went in because they've been watching since 2015 to 2022 that the Minsk peace agreement had never been implemented. As the European leaders later admitted, it was just to buy time to build up a big Ukrainian army. So for this reason, this whole gamble of just putting in a big military, frighten the Ukrainians into signing a peace deal that would end NATO expansion, it didn't play out because what happened, of course, in April of 2022, the UK, the US convinced Zelensky to reject this peace agreement and instead fight. Now, what you then saw happen was also that, well, not only did the peace agreement get shoved aside, but we also saw that the Europeans then began to abandon, as well as the US, abandon all diplomacy. That is, we didn't want to talk to the Russians anymore, and we began to send all our weapons to Ukraine, saying that this will be resolved on the battlefield. So then it became a war of attrition, and so the Russians then had to go into an industrial production of their weapons. They had to build a big army, equip this big army, train them, and so a lot of this took some time. And I think we on our side as well, we miscalculated some of what the Russians were doing, because when they pulled back from Kherson and Kharkov, what we thought were that they were fleeing, but they were just tightening up the defensive lines, digging in, and then just starting to bleed out the Ukrainian army, and essentially defeating it, because without negotiations there wouldn't be any political settlement. So that was the only path to victory. So the war took on a very different character. And again, but it's not just Ukraine. In NATO, we sent all our weapons now to Ukraine. Not all our weapons, but we emptied most of our weapon depots. We've provided all the intelligence, logistics, targeting, military planning, which we could. So the Russians have really been fighting collective NATO for 4 years now.
Yeah. But how does this end?
Well, if it would have ended in beginning of 2022, it would have been quite easy. As we learned then from the Istanbul negotiations, it would simply have been Ukraine restores its neutrality. That means no NATO troops in Ukraine, and definitely nothing that resembles NATO membership. But then as the war went on, this whole thing manifested itself as a territorial dispute, as the Russians now claim these 4 oblasts. And so the way the war will end would be, I think the Ukrainian army will begin to show signs of collapse. It will fall apart. You already see the Russians now moving faster and faster westward. And I think at some point it will dawn on many of the Western leaders that if we don't make a deal now, the problem isn't that Ukraine lost 4 regions, they might lose 8. And this is simply because, well, when we're now saying that after this war, Ukraine will be a part of NATO, what the Russians are hearing is, well, whatever we don't take will end up as NATO territory, which can be used against us. So for this reason, if they're faced with the option of a neutral Ukraine, which then it can keep, for example, Odessa, if they think it's going to end up in NATO's orbit, they will take Odessa. So I think once Ukraine begins to collapse and the Russians are plowing westward, the Europeans would be either have to send in their army and fight the Russians directly, or they will have to accept a very painful concession that they lost this war, which means restoring Ukraine's neutrality and accepting the territorial concessions.
So you think that Russia would essentially have to invade pretty much all of Ukraine, like start taking more and more of Ukraine in order to force neutrality, essentially?
Oh, no, not all of Ukraine. I think the idea of going into Western Ukraine would be madness. There would be no one welcoming. There would be no welcome there. One of the reasons they also annexed these territories are when they went into Donbass, for example, you need support when you're occupying this mass amount of territory. You need support from the civilian governments, the regional. Now, nobody would work with the Russians if they think they're just going to hand them over to the Ukrainians after the war, in which, God knows what will happen to them as they're seen as traitors. So annexing these territories was kind of like a way of making sure that they had the loyalties and support by local government, and that got some local allies. Now, but going into Western Ukraine, then nobody would welcome the Russians there with any flowers. But these regions of Donbass, they used to be part of Russia. This was part of the Russian Empire. Even Odessa, was founded by the Russians. So this became part of Ukraine by Lenin's choice back in 1922. So the Russians are essentially redoing this Soviet history, but this is why the majority there are Russian speakers in Donbass. They always vote favorably towards Russia. If you see the people fighting now on the Russian side, a large amount of them are officially Ukrainians from Donbass, so fighting with the Russians. So all of this matters, but there's no way of holding territory in the west of Ukraine. Also, there wouldn't be any incentive for it. But
how does that solve Russia's problem? I mean, if they take the territory or make if they split Ukraine essentially in half, and half of Ukraine becomes neutral and the West remains hostile, how does that change it? I don't know what the point of that is, because they would still end up with NATO on their border. I mean, I would imagine that Western Ukraine, if the country got split, Western Ukraine would absolutely do everything that it could to try to join NATO, to try to be a part of NATO, to allow NATO bases on their territory. What would be the difference? All they've done is pushed where their border is. So if they say we don't want NATO on our border, well, the more territory you take, you still end up with NATO on your border.
Yes, but it's also where NATO would be. This is why I think the Russians will go for Odessa unless there's a peace agreement coming forth, because a key appeal of Ukraine for us in NATO would be that it will give us a larger footprint in the Black Sea. So, for example, we see this now. The Ukrainians are a very appealing proxy in the Black Sea because they can attack the Russian Black Sea fleet and making things very difficult there for Russian shipping. Now, what happens if the Russians take Odessa is that Ukraine will be landlocked. Also, if you look at these territories from Kharkov to Odessa and essentially all the historical Russian territories, this is where the agriculture is. This is where the natural resources are. This is the entire coastline of Ukraine. And this is the historical Russian lands where the Russian speakers are. So if they strip them of all this land, then it's going to be less territory which is attractive for NATO. So it's going to reduce their market value essentially. And also, it's going to not expose the Russians anymore in the Black Sea. So, but of course, it is a problem. That is the whole discussion. Well, a lot of the discussions in Moscow now as well is we're winning the war, but how can you win the peace? And I think this is an interesting thing to ask, because if there is no security agreement or peace agreement, then they will take back the historical Russian lands and they will just wreck the rest of it, make sure that the infrastructure is destroyed, and that it becomes a basket case, not a powerful proxy which can be used against it in the future. But this is not great for Russia. It's not great for Europe. Definitely not good for Ukraine, because it would be a region of instability for decades to come. So nobody really gains from this, which is why I think there's some incentives to find some peaceful settlement. But that would have to be a recognition of a new status quo, not just freeze the front lines.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know why Russia would trust any sort of peace agreement. I mean, there have been agreements in the past, and a new president comes in, especially here in the US, a new president comes in and everything changes almost overnight. So how could you trust it? The next guy comes in and says, actually, never mind, we're going to start back up against Russia and we're going to expand NATO more and we're going to push Ukraine into it, right? I mean, how can they even trust any of it? It just seems to me like the only option Russia has would be to just take all the territory you want along the Black Sea and be done with it. Because I don't know what the solution is on the peace side.
No, I agree, and that's how they see it. Because keep in mind that NATO promised in the 90s they wouldn't expand to the east. The
Right.
Ukrainians had it in their constitution that they would be neutral, but all you needed was a coup, and then they would be pulled into the NATO orbit. So of course, all of this could be reversed. And again, that they made all these deals as well. Keep in mind that in 2013, when the NATO countries began to destabilize Ukraine and working towards the coup, Ukraine and Russia then proposed to the EU, how about we have a trilateral agreement? And the Europeans said, no, we can't have this. Ukraine has to choose. When they chose wrong, then they really instigated the riots. Now, the thing is, the Europeans initially signed under as guarantors for unity government back in 2014, but then they broke it the day after when there was a coup. You had the Minsk agreement, and as I said before, the Angela Merkel and Franco Hollande, the Germans and the French already admitted that this was just to buy time to build a big Ukrainian army. Then you had the Istanbul agreement. This was sabotaged as well. Even now, when the Europeans are saying, let's get a ceasefire, they don't want to make any concessions. They keep saying they don't want to let go of NATO expansion. They're essentially saying we need some time to rearm Ukraine and rebuild its army so it can really defend itself, which means no political settlement. We just want to buy some time. So there's a lot of distrust, and for good reason. So no, I don't think the Russians trust it, which is why the territorial acquisition is guaranteed that these territories won't again be used as a front line.
It seems to me that there's two ways to end this war. The first one would be to disband NATO entirely. If NATO just dissolved and went away, then that would that would solve Russia's problem, right? And Russia maybe would say, okay, well then we're done with this. Or the other way to maybe end the war is to add Ukraine into NATO and tell the Russians, that's it. If you continue, we're actually going to send troops and wage a war against you. Seems like those would be two options. I mean, I don't know. I'm surprised at this point that Europe hasn't sent in troops. I mean, they keep talking about Russia's the big bad, expansionist. And so why, if Europe really feels that way, why are they not absolutely bringing Ukraine into NATO and sending troops to fight the Russians?
Well, first, I don't think they really believe what they're saying, and I think they're trying to drum up or inflate the threat to pull the Americans deeper into this war. The thing is, for the Europeans have since the 90s recognized that if we expand NATO too much, then it will be seen as a threat by the Russians. You had Angela Merkel once, the Chancellor of Germany, warning that if we try to pull Ukraine into NATO, Moscow would interpret this as a declaration of war. In 2008, when the Americans were pushing for expanding NATO, you had the French, German ambassadors, as we learned from WikiLeaks, telling the Americans that this would trigger a civil war, maybe a Russian intervention. Even the American ambassador to Russia, which then became the CIA director, William Burns, wrote this memo back in 2008 when he predicted that, this would likely trigger a civil war within Ukraine, and then the Russians would intervene on behalf of the Eastern Ukrainians. They're not going to accept having NATO in Ukraine. It doesn't make any sense. So the Russians essentially would behave exactly as the US would if the Russians tried to pull Mexico into a Russian military alliance and put its missiles there. It's not going to happen. So the Europeans knew this for a long time. So I have a hard time believing them when they say that Russia's just trying to restore the Soviet Union. They will not stop. They're just out for territory. Because no one in Moscow laid any claims to anything in Ukraine before 2014. The Ukrainians didn't consider Russia a threat before 2014. Then 2014 came. What all the Western leaders had known all along is if we try to do this, then the Russians will respond fiercely. And that's what they did. And now suddenly we all have to conform to these narratives that the Russians, Putin is the new Hitler. They want to take over Europe. First is Donbass, next Paris, But no, if this was true, the Europeans would have begun to rebuild their armies a long time ago, which they haven't. And this is the main problem. This is why the Europeans can't go to war. They need the Americans to fight this war against the Russians, because the Europeans, they don't have any proper armies anymore. They can't put up enough men. They don't have the weaponry. So no, meanwhile, the Russian army is now much stronger than it was in 2022, and it's also been battle hardened. So there's no, I think so far it's a lot of talk, but once we face defeat in Ukraine, things could change. Then the Russians might get too bold, and we might try to rescue the situation by redefining this proxy war even further. And I think this is likely area which will trigger a direct war between NATO countries and Russia. That is, sorry for going on, but if you remember in the beginning of this, when the Russians invaded, the Germans only wanted to send helmets. You had Joe Biden saying that we can't send the tanks. This is too provocative. F-16s means World War III. This was the logic, but gradually now we have leaders saying, we have to bring this war to Russia. And we have missiles launched by Western contractors into Russian cities. So, but now, of course, the Europeans will get more aggressive to prevent the collapse of Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Russians will feel much, much bolder because the Ukrainian army is being defeated. Why would they accept that the Russians would bring war to them, but they can't bring war to the Europeans? So I wouldn't be too surprised if you're going to see in the future the Russians shooting down some drones or airplanes over the Black Sea that are Westerners who are picking targets for the Ukrainians to strike Russia. Once that happens, things can go very bad very quickly.
Just seems like old rivalries die hard. I mean, it's just we're just replaying Germany versus Russia over and over and over again. It feels like, except this time we're on the German side. And I don't know if it's obviously not a good idea.
But there's a lot of truth to what you said there, because the Germans have a long history of this. I mean, if you look at the way World War I ended, it was the Germans getting essentially independence, they said, for Ukraine. But as all historians recognize, the Brest-Litovsk peace agreement, which ended the war between Russia and Germany, they framed it as getting independence for Ukraine. But what it meant was to exert a German dominance over Ukraine. But, eventually the Germans lost, so they didn't get it. Then in the Second World War, Nazi Germany did the exact same thing. They began to cultivate these relations with the fascists in Ukraine under the guise of delivering sovereignty and independence from Russia. In reality, they were establishing German dominance. And now you see the exact same thing over again. But you're right, this time we are with the Germans.
Yeah, which historically has not been on the right side. And I think maybe on this side, also not on the right side this time around. Let's talk about the Europeans and why are the Europeans so aggressive against the Russians? I mean, here you've got the United States, the US President Donald Trump wanting peace with Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, wanting to even talking about eventually building partnerships and working with Russia, not against Russia, not keeping them out of the Western world, but instead embracing them. A lot of people have said, it's a big mistake that we basically drove Russia and China together. And so some are saying we should actually bring Russia back into the Western fold, into the Western world. But in Europe keep the war rhetoric going. And in fact, the Netherlands has been really quite aggressive. The Russian embassy to the Netherlands issued this statement saying, over the past few weeks, high-ranking officials of the kingdom have been firing off threatening statements against Russia, crossing all reasonable boundaries, not to mention the completely unacceptable rude tone of their statements regarding the Russian leadership. Acting Minister of Defense Breckelmans regularly calls for increased military support for the criminals in Kiev and declares the need to be prepared for conflict with Russia by 2030. Acting Minister Artsen, Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, in turn announces plans to change the structure of rail transport in the Netherlands, under which the transport of military cargo will take priority over civilian transport. These measures are directly aimed at optimizing NATO logistics towards the Russian borders. Following Finnish President Stubb's visit to the Netherlands, it has become clear that the main thesis being promoted by the Dutch officials is the further increase of military support for Ukraine and the strengthening of NATO's capabilities. Against whom exactly? That is a rhetorical question. At the same time, the kingdom's authorities are trying to present such steps as an attempt to ensure peace in Europe through force. It should be clearly understood that threats against Russia are the last thing that contributes to strengthening security. One should not expect that Moscow does not hear and notice such statements. Russian President Vladimir Putin has spoken very clearly on this matter. We are not planning to go to war against Europe. I have said that 100 times. But if Europe wants to wage war against us and suddenly starts a war with us, we are ready. It does seem, and obviously the Russians putting out a strong statement like this saying, hey, you guys are saying you are talking war by 2030. Okay, we're ready for you. This isn't good. This isn't good. What are the Europeans thinking? They're really why do they want to wage war with Russia so badly? What is it that they're so afraid of?
Oh, that's a great question, but it's worth noting as well that the EU foreign policy chief Kaja Kallas, she's on one occasion at least made the comment that if it would be great when we win this war, because if Russia can be broken into many smaller countries, then they will be more peaceful and manageable. You also had the president of Poland come out and say that Russia is a prison of nations. There's at least 200 nations within Russia, which is more than there's on the whole planet of countries, and they could all be liberated. So the destruction of Russia is obviously communicated on several occasions, and the Europeans now also don't shy away from recognizing that it's their intelligence, their missiles, their contractors, which are contributing to attacks on Russia, but also initially all the rhetoric was about helping Ukraine, protecting Ukraine. Now, of course, as you alluded to, the rhetoric has changed. Now they're talking about, well, the Ukrainians have to fight for at least for 2-3 more years so we can prepare for the Russians. We'll be ready for war in 2-3 years. I mean, this is the former pro-NATO presidential candidate of Ukraine, Yulia Tymoshenko. When she heard the German intelligence chief say, we have to keep the Ukrainians fighting for 5 more years because then we'll be ready ourselves for a war. She said this was our greatest fear. We're just essentially meat which the Europeans are throwing at the Russians, hoping to weaken a strategic rival. Now, in terms of why the Europeans are so hawkish, this is the great mystery, because for all these years, it was the Americans who were pushing for more NATO expansion, harsher policies towards Russia, and then it was the Europeans who tried to hit the brakes and say, well, maybe you should understand the Russian security concerns. Now, of course, that has been flipped completely, and I think the reason is that
it's been very surprising to see that. I thought for sure that when America said, all right, we want peace, that Europe would be like, oh, thank goodness, we want peace too. But instead it has been so surprising that the Europeans have instead flipped and said, wait a minute, what? You want peace? That's unacceptable. We want war. I mean, it's just been insane.
Yeah, and at least when there's American hostilities, the belligerent intentions can be backed up by capabilities. But the Europeans, they are becoming very aggressive, but there's no capabilities to back it up. So it doesn't really make sense. And also, no one really defines what it means to defeat the Russia. It's the world's largest nuclear power. It wouldn't go very well, especially when they consider this to be an existential threat. So I think nuclear bombs would drop on European cities long before the Europeans will be able to take Crimea anyways. So no, it is quite mad. And as President Putin also commented, he made the point that, we've been in the Ukraine war, it's been very low civilian casualties, because they say we consider this to be a brotherly people. I can understand the criticism, you can make what you want of it, but he also made clear that if we were to fight the Europeans, and he sees this mainly as a war now by the Europeans against Russia using Ukrainians, we would fight very differently. So I think if the Europeans expect that they would just join in, add some more weight on the Ukrainian side in terms of soldiers, that this is how they would be able to have escalation control. I think it's mistaken. The Russians, as President Putin suggested, would fight the Europeans very differently. And they're now building all these hypersonic, massively powerful missiles like the Oreshnik, which they would bring a lot of pain to Europe if they actually want to go to war with Russia. So, but the rhetoric in Europe now is very difficult. Anyone who doesn't support the most hawkish language against Russia, well, then they're pro-Russian. That's the language they use. So there's no acceptance of dissent anymore.
Has there been a history of this hostility? And I mean, besides Germany, outside of Germany, has there been a history of fear or hostility between these European nations and Russia?
Yeah, a very long history. That is, if you go back 200 years, especially in the 1830s in Britain, you had many who were writing about Russophobia, where they warned that this is a dangerous thing that are plaguing our elites, because they said, of course, Russia's a big country. Sometimes our interests clash, and we should be prepared to confront. But they also made the point that the hatred of Russia goes beyond any of this. It means that we have to confront them all the time, even when there's no competing interests. So, and that results in policies which undermines our own national interests. So, this has been recognized as a key problem for at least the past 200 years. You probably could. I think it was probably the defeat of Napoleon, which put a lot of concern in for the British and other Europeans that the Russians were very powerful, and that you would have this land power from the east, which would be able to essentially defeat most of the European states.
So, do you think that that's where it's coming from? That it's just coming from this historical, just a long. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. I don't think we see any sign of Russia wanting to invade Europe and take Europe. So I'm not sure where this fear on the European side, why they feel like, well, if they get Ukraine, then we're next. Like, where is this actually coming from?
Well, I think a part of it is the whole structure of the European security architecture. Keep in mind that initially we had plans for, well, if you want proper security, because all states compete for security. So that's the whole point with Ukraine, for example. It was security for one will be insecurity for another. Now, when the Cold War came to an end, we all recognized that we would need a new security architecture, not based on bloc politics, but indivisible security. That is, one side shouldn't expand their security at the expense of the other. So we developed, for example, and signed with the Russians the Charter of Paris for a New Europe in 1990. We established the OSCE as an inclusive security institution in 1994. All of them were based on the idea we wouldn't have a Europe with dividing lines. We would have indivisible security. However, we also realized that the Russians were weak and getting weaker. So why have a security architecture we have to take into account their security? Why not just go for hegemonic peace? That is, we would be so dominant, it doesn't matter what the Russians fear or not. And this was the general idea. This was also communicated by the US Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, because he thought this was a horrible idea. And he made the point. Everyone recognizes this is a horrible idea, that it will alienate the Russians. But it doesn't matter. They're weak now. And this was the general idea. So this is what NATO was when the West decided to go for a hegemonic peace, that is unipolarity. NATO expansion became the manifestation of that. We abandoned a common security architecture, and we then just returned to the bloc politics and moved it towards Russian borders. Now, this time the logic for the Europeans was, well, this will cement the US position on the continent. This will then create a collective hegemon in the world, the US and EU together, which will more or less dominate the world and push the Russians out. The problem, of course, now what you see is happening something very different, which is that the Russians they're back, they're strong, as George Kennan warned, by the way, and they would come back with a vengeance. And for this reason, the Americans have to adjust now to a multipolar world. Now, if you're American, what do you do in a multipolar world when there's many centers of power and the US has less relative power? Well, you want to focus on the Western Hemisphere. You want to focus on Asia. In other words, you don't want to waste too much of your resources in Europe, and you want to pull the Russians closer to you, so you get them away from the Chinese. So a lot of what the US is doing now makes sense. And this is now the panic of the Europeans, because they essentially went to war with Russia with the promise of this would restore the unipolar world order, the collective hegemon of the political West, that is the EU and the US. Instead, we're losing this war. And as a result, the Americans will pull out of Europe. NATO might fall apart. And in this multipolar world, the interests of the European states will be pulled in different directions. We might fragment. And for this reason, this has almost become a war. Not almost. This is a war for world order, which is why they're desperate to defeat Russia. As when this war comes to an end, the world will look very, very different from them. So it's the Polish president, prime minister referred to it as if we lose this war, it will be the end of the golden age for the West. That was his words. And so that kind of suggests the panic which are at play here.
If Europe should be afraid of anybody fragmenting Europe and causing this, it would be the United States. I think that they should fear, because the U.S. has even blatantly stated it. Did you hear about that document? There was a secret document that was leaked that there was like a plan to fragment Europe. That was that the White House has come up with a plan on how to fragment Europe, and it is to pull Italy, I believe Hungary and Italy. Was there maybe a couple of other nations that were on that list where they have this document, this plan that they were like, well, we can fragment Europe. We could pull these states out of the EU. They're not really having the shared values as the rest of the EU, so maybe they can stand separately. And that was like a US secret plan that was just recently leaked.
Well, it's to some extent been confirmed by the new U.S. national security strategy. That is, it also recognizes that Europe is on the wrong path. It accuses the European leaders of being authoritarian, undemocratic. They're overseeing, they're essentially taking Europe down the wrong path, becoming economically uncompetitive, unable to reproduce their culture or civilization. I think they use the word civilizational erasure. So this is quite, strong accusation, and it reflects the speech that J.D. Vance gave in Munich back in February. Now, it's not hard to not agree with this, because look at what's happening in Germany. The policies are they're doing this very, very unpopular. So now the main opposition party is a party that was established, I think, in 2013, the Alternative for Deutschland, most popular party in Germany now. And how does Germany respond? They label it an extremist organization, so the intelligence agencies can go after it. The politicians and media are openly talking about banning the largest party in Germany. In France, they arrested Le Pen, which is the main opposition to Macron. In Romania, they voted for the wrong guy in the presidential election, so they just annulled the results. Because he didn't want this war on Russia. I mean, things aren't going well in Europe at all. And only now, was it yesterday, the EU began to sanction its own one of its own citizens, a French military official, but also a Swiss colonel, because he had repeated narratives of the Kremlin. This is, so things aren't going well. So I don't doubt that this document is true. That's very possible that they see the EU as being not a desirable partner, but someone that is destroying Europe. And so
I just found this. Okay, so what it was a secret file that was reported by Defense One, claims that Trump intends to pull Austria, Italy, Hungary, and Poland away from the EU and closer to Washington's circle of influence. It was this a security strategy called Make Europe Great. It was a Make Europe Great Again strategy, 33-page national security strategy, and saying that, suggesting that it is far from obvious whether certain European countries will remain reliable allies. That's like what some are saying now, and also that this was to seek sovereignty and preservation, restoration of traditional European ways of life, which I don't know why this isn't sparking outrage with Americans. People voted for Donald Trump to make America great again, and it seems like all he focuses on is everywhere but America. But and this leaked strategy, this secret strategy to pull Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Poland out of the EU. Why do you think they narrowed in on those 4 countries?
Well, it's countries which doesn't necessarily have a strategic interest in the EU now that the US will begin to decouple a bit from this transatlantic relationship. Now, I think, especially for a country like Poland, they've always been a bit worried for historical reasons. They've always been trapped between the Germans and the Russians, and been crushed in the process. So if you're Polish, you like the EU because it gives you collective bargaining power within this economic bloc. but at the same time, you will also come under greater German pressure. So this is something that the Poles have reacted to in the past, which is why they prefer to have more US presence in Europe, because the US also puts a check on the Germans. And so when you now see the Germans saying that their objective is to build the largest and most powerful army in in Europe, it's worth remembering that not everyone in Europe sees this favorably as a positive development. Some people have a historical memory. So no, I think this yes, been strategically picked, but also going, of course, for more conservative governments.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Do you think that would work? Do you think those countries would say, you know what, actually, we want out of the EU?
Well, if they were asked today, maybe no, but I think gradually they can be pulled off. So the EU already has a lot of problems. A lot of the unity was premised on the idea that it was able to deliver material goods for its member states through this collective bargaining. That is, if you join the EU, it will be an economic powerhouse. They use this economic power to also form this asymmetrical economic interdependence with neighboring states, which allows them to dictate trade agreements. But this is in the past, since they now cut themselves off from Russia, for example. The whole Germany was supposed to be the economic locomotive driving Europe forward. Now, of course, they're deindustrializing at an incredible pace, because it turns out when your economy is organized around heavy industries which are energy intensive, and you cut yourself off from your main energy source, that is Russia, that things will go badly in your economy. So everything in Europe is shifting very quickly now. So the good economy, good governance, all of these things are going out the window. So I think as the world changes quickly, some countries will look for a better deal. And I think this is a likely development, to be honest.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, really interesting leaked document that came out, that Make Europe Great Again strategy. Quite interesting. Thank you for watching this clip from the full Kim Iversen Show, which you can watch Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific at KimIversonShow.com. See you there.